Hi everyone, in this step-by-step tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint this snow leopard's eye in acrylics. Now the tips and techniques that I'm going to share here and the layering process can be applied when painting any eye. So let's jump straight into it. So the first thing that I like to do, and this is the case when painting any eye, I will map in the shape of the darkest part of the eyelid. This is enabling me to make sure that I've got the shape of the eye correct before I focus on any highlights or iris colour. Once I was happy with that, I can then start mapping in the pupil and picking out my main reference points. Now when I work with eyes, my main reference points are predominantly this black eyelid and also the highlight in the eye. Any reflection that stands out that's particularly bright, I want to be mapping those in first. Now the position of the highlight is really important. It's going to follow the general top curve of that eye, so you want to make sure that that is accurate. Now the other thing as well is we don't have to block in the brightest highlight, because with acrylics we have that wonderful advantage of once that layer is dry we can just put another lighter layer on top. As long as I make sure it's light enough to stand out from the iris colour, which is what I'm currently mapping in now, then that is absolutely fine. We can build up our values from there. So what I'm now going to start to do, as you can see, is keep on using my smaller brushes so I can be very accurate with the way that I'm applying my paint. Here I'm just basically blocking in one solid colour. Now quite often I don't recommend to do this, but my main aim at the moment is to hide that background colour. So I've gone with a little bit more of an opaque mixture. Now opacity or an opaque colour is where you cannot see through that layer. If you have a transparent layer, as that name would suggest, it would enable you to see the layers underneath, which is where your glazes come in. And we're going to be showing parts of that in this tutorial later on. But what I'm going to start doing now is reinforcing my shading. Now this is a key part of any painting of an eye. We have to make sure that we've got that subtle shadow at the top, and in some cases, depending on the light source, you'll also have it on the sides. And I'm very carefully here just building up my layers to make sure that I'm getting not only a soft blended look between my first layer and this second layer, but also I'm reinforcing my contrasts. Now one thing that I like to do when working with acrylics is while I'm waiting for one section to dry, I will start working on the next, and that's what I'm doing here. So I'm now going to start to reinforce that highlight on the lower part of the eye. Now in all tutorials here on YouTube and on Patreon, I do mention about the values and the contrast a lot, because it's one of the things that's going to massively impact how three-dimensional the finished painting will look. So I'm going to start to mapping that highlight on the lower part of the eye, and now I'm going back in and reinforcing the shadow at the top. These subtle layer changes here are what's going to make this eye look realistic, so it's really important to make sure that we focus on our values and our contrast first. You'll notice that I'm not focusing on the colour at all at this stage. It's really not important. So once I've got a nice base foundation in from light to dark, I can then start reinforcing some of the patterns in the eye. Now depending on the eye that you're working on, the patterns and the way that they are directed is going to vary from animal to animal. So we do want to make sure that we're studying the reference photo closely. But regardless of the way that that pattern is forming, I will still apply the layers in the same way. I'm paying very close attention to at what point the length of that brushstroke should start and stop to give me the right type of pattern, and again I'm making sure that I'm moving that brush in the right direction. Now if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that when I paint fur, I do put a lot of focus on three main things: fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. Now these three things can also be implemented when painting eyes. The amount of pressure that I'm currently applying to my brushes, where I'm holding it on that brush, even down to the way that I've got my wrist positioned, all of these things are going to affect the type of brushstroke that I create. Now in my real-time tutorials on Patreon, because I'm painting with a voiceover while I'm working, I'm able to explain all of this in the moment. If I decide to hold my brush in a specific way, I will of course mention that in the tutorial, because there is a reason for it. And if you would like to paint along to this tutorial, this is available on Patreon, all in real time, as I say, no parts sped up, no sections cut out. You get the reference photo liner and full material list. Because I am painting this with a voiceover while I'm working, there are no sections where I rush through any technique. It's all explained in that moment, and it's a perfect one to paint along to. So if this snow leopard tutorial or any of my other in-depth tutorials are of interest, I'll link my Patreon in the description below. So when I work with acrylics, while I'm waiting for one section to dry, I will then start working on the next, and that's what I'm starting to do here. Before I could work with my glazes and adjust the colour of the eye, I had to make sure that all of the layers that I had just done had completely dried. So I'm going to take this opportunity to now map in some of the highlights and reflections on the lower part of the eyelid. I'm paying very close attention here, as you can see, to the shading on both ends of this highlight. I don't want there to be a sudden start and stop point because it's going to look more two-dimensional. The shading, just like with the shadow at the top of the eye, is so important in making this look like it is curved. You'll also notice that I'm working from dark to light, so I haven't jumped in with my brightest highlight first. Quite often, if you zoom into an eye, you can see that the reflection or the highlight in the corner of the eye, it has a darkened edge and then it has a lighter centre. What I want to do is build up that lighter centre in a couple of layers. Rather than jumping in with the brightest value that we can see first, we must make sure that we paint in the darkest section initially and then add your lighter layers on top. And again, while I was waiting for the highlight to dry, I'm just going to carry on mapping in a little bit more of that pattern marble effect of the iris. Now I have to make sure that the pattern here is in place first because I'm now going to work with my first glaze. So this here is something that I get asked quite a lot about on YouTube, and it's how I use my glazes to adjust my colour. I don't use any glazing mediums. I prefer just to thin my paint with water to give me a transparent mixture, and then I apply that to my layers that are dry. That's the really important part. You can't apply a glaze if the layers underneath are still wet, because that glaze will mix in with that paint and then you won't be adjusting the colour in the same way. So that's really important. Now the way that I like to use glazes is I will use that to tint the colour of the layers underneath. And by working this way, when we're building up the layers previously, we only have to focus on our values. We don't also have to then put pressure on ourselves about mixing the exact colour that we can see in the reference photo. And I think that if you are an artist who does try to focus on mixing the exact colour, and that's something that can cause you some stress and anxiety, then using glazes like this could really help. Now again, this is something that I cover in all of my in-depth tutorials because this is my preferred way of working. Glazes is a big part of all of my acrylic paintings, so if you would like to see exactly how I use them all in real time, then as I've said, my Patreon is linked in the description below. Now if you've got any art related questions or maybe requests that you'd like me to paint a specific animal, then do let me know in the comments because I'm more than happy to tailor this content as best as I can. Now one thing I would also recommend is when you are using glazes is always add a few more layers on top. So what I don't do is I don't work with all of my layers, do one glaze and then call it finished. Because I do find that adjusting the colour in various stages gets a little bit more depth to that finished painting and does make a really big difference to the overall piece. So what I'll do is build up the layers previously, which I've shown in this tutorial. I then apply my glaze, I wait for that to dry, and now I'm starting to add in more of that pattern. This is a slightly lighter mixture, so therefore I'm hinting at more of those highlights within the top layers of the eye. I wait for that to dry and then I'm going to apply another glaze. And this is now how I will switch between my layers and reinforcing my values and my contrast. Now I talk about it so much, I've mentioned it a few times already in this tutorial because this is the main thing that I want to get right. Look at how I'm now adding another lighter layer. I'm not focusing on the colour, although I do have some blue in this mixture, it doesn't have to be the exact right colour. A glaze can fix that in a matter of seconds, but I do want to be building up my highlights and reinforcing my shadows. Now something that will also happen is as you're building up your layers like this, you may find that the pupil will actually shrink in size because you've accidentally painted over some of the edges. Now that's okay, it's nothing to worry about, but I would recommend, as I am here, going back in with your dark mixture if it's black, or maybe you've added a little bit of blue or purple to your black, go back in and reinforce the shape and size of that pupil. I will also always go over the outside darkest part of the eye for the same reason, just to make sure that I've got this the right shape, that it's the right size. The shape of that eye, the pupil, all of these things make a huge difference, and it's very, very noticeable if they're not right. So again, I always make sure that once I've got the main section of the eye in place and I'm about 70-80% complete, that I start making sure that I've still got the same shape and correct size of that eye. So I have also created a time-lapse tutorial of this snow leopard here on YouTube, and it's from start to finish, so you can get an idea of how I'm building up the layers of the fur. So if that's of interest, I will link the YouTube version in the description below. Now when I work on fur, I will always get an area about 80% complete before I move on to the next section. Whereas with eyes, I want to make sure that pretty much 99% of it is done and I'm happy with it before I move on. The reason being, if the eyes aren't right, it can bring down the entire painting. So for me personally, I've always made sure that I've got those in place, I'm happy with them before I'll even consider working on the fur around the eye. Now just briefly mentioning that, look at how I'm working on such small sections. Even though this eye is fairly small, I've still broken it up into individual layers and smaller sections. I was working on the highlight, I was working on the lower reflection of the iris, then the pupil, the lower highlight on the eyelid. All of these things make something that's potentially complex a bit more easier to approach and less overwhelming. So if you do find yourself hesitating or maybe looking at your reference photo more than painting, it might be because you're working on too much of a larger area, or you're expecting your painting to look like that photo too early on. And this is something that I do see quite often. In order to build up this amount of realism, there are many layers that goes into it. I can't expect to achieve this much detail with 2 or 3 layers. So I really do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be really grateful. I also upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then hit that subscribe and the bell button. And here is a photo of my finished painting, and the background of this is also included in that real-time tutorial on Patreon as well. So as I've said, if you have got any questions about anything I've covered in this tutorial, or any art related questions, then feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube at the end of the week, and as always, thank you so much for watching.